2. The, quote, intermediary forms, unquote. Contemporary socialism is a prey to two contradictory sentiments with regard to the totalitarian states. It abhors and denounces their political regime, which deprives the masses of the people of their elementary rights, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and liberty of association. At the same time, it is compelled to recognize the efforts of these states to control and direct their economic systems. We are well aware, of course, that their efforts in this respect are inspired by damnable ends: the consolidation of a pitiless dictatorship over the working people, and at any rate in Germany and Italy, preparations for a war of aggression. However, from the economic point of view, these totalitarian states have brought new facts into being. More than anyone else, they have developed what we have termed, quote, control levers. Thus, they are laying the foundations for a controlled economic system delivered from the anarchy of the capitalist market. These control levers are being developed in order to bring about the establishment of a controlled economy, because without such levers, a controlled economy would be impossible. The aversion which democratic socialism feels towards the totalitarian states, where human beings are harassed and persecuted for their opinions, must not, however, deflect us from an objective examination of the economic structure of these states and of the control levers which are being developed before our eyes. These observations apply equally, it must be pointed out, to both Germany and Italy and to Russia. No doubt we shall be asked whether it is possible for democratic socialists to discipline themselves to the necessary objectivity. We shall reply with a distinct affirmation, providing the Marxist method is scrupulously followed. 90 years ago, Marx was faced with a youthful and hardly developed capitalism. Today we are faced with a new economic system developing in the totalitarian states. Whilst overwhelming adolescent capitalism with those vehement criticisms which we all know. Marx never ceased to stress the progressive side of that same capitalism in comparison with the feudal system of which it was the heir, while ceaselessly stigmatizing the sufferings which the new economic system inflicted upon the working class. Marx justly insisted on the immense progress represented by capitalism as compared with the defunct feudal system. It is in this way that we should examine both the fascist and Soviet economic systems. We are well aware of, and we have denounced the dictatorial regimes established in these countries, which are reactionary as compared with the aspirations of the workers, deprived of all liberty and, above all, the right of free association. Ew. However, their economic systems are nonetheless progressive as compared with liberal capitalism. Compared with liberal capitalism, they represent a superior stage of social evolution, inasmuch as they do strive to control and discipline the blind laws of the capitalist market, and towards this end they develop appropriate control levers. So that's important. That's an important statement right there, because that's something that Rizzi, obviously with huge democratic caveats, Laurat is making here. He seems in agreement with Rizzi that these societies, not just the Soviet Union, but indeed fascist and Nazi Germany, are progressive in some economic dimension as well, which is what Rizzi believed. Now, Rizzi would not endorse. Rizzi endorsed encouraged the working classes to side with Stalinism and with fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, because they were objectively laying the preconditions for socialism. Other people, the American bureaucratic collectivists, and I'm assuming Laurat did not have that point of view in terms of like politics, but I think there were some changes within the bureaucratic collectivists about whether they viewed the Soviet Union as progressive or not. I think they did. I think at least some of them did. Like, I think at least Max Shachtman in his early period viewed the continued nationalization of property as progressive, even if that the content of that nationalized property was exploitative and reactionary. But that's kind of. But I think towards the end he viewed it as like full tilt a reactionary system. But like all socialist critics, I mean, this is the thing, is like, no, even though some Trotskyists or Trotsky would try to act as though people who criticize the reactionary nature of the Stalinist system as a whole, no socialist, except for maybe like some odd market socialist or something like that, would ever favor the restoration of private property. That was by no means any left-wing person's goal in the Soviet Union. And most left-wing people, for instance, would very much, whatever they might say about the Soviet Union, would agree that the neoliberalist shock therapy reforms in the Eastern Bloc in the 1990s was disastrous for the populations of those countries, and especially the working classes. But yeah, but sorry, I got distracted by my own thinking. But it's interesting that Laurat characterizes these regimes as like economically progressive. Let us recall the striking formula used by Marx in drawing a distinction between the machine itself and the use to which the machine was put by capitalism. Towards those workers who wanted to destroy machinery, Marx stressed that the machine as such was the instrument par excellence of their emancipation, and that only its capitalist utilization with a view to the production of surplus value is to be condemned. In the dictatorial countries, we can see new instruments developing and forming themselves. However, they are not instruments of iron and steel, but social machinery, which we have termed, quote, control levers. These control levers, these legal institutions, permit the influencing of the market and the directing of economic activity, and they must be judged as Marx judged the machinery of iron and steel. That's a completely illegitimate comparison. To say, like capitalism is a form of social machinery. The institutions of capitalism is social machinery, and they don't have an inherent neutrality. But I think this is kind of something that I don't really know too much about Lucien Laurat, but I definitely think he was like a parliamentary socialist, not an anarchist or libertarian or council communist or anything like that. And he definitely viewed the bourgeois state as or just the state period as kind of like a neutral, in some sense, a neutral instrument, right? Just like whatever, the content of that state is totally dictated by like political will of those who rule it, as if there was no kind of certain social and negative social consequences of that form itself, or negative social. There's nothing negative or enslaving or non-emancipatory in that social form. Anyway, but I'm just gonna say that's like saying that, like, I don't know, like this is actually kind of bringing up an interesting, very interesting kind of like thoughts from like a theoretical perspective, right? That's one of the things, especially when you take into consideration like certain ecological functions, but also social functions about how like work and things are experienced, and like all the other considerations. Just because a certain means of production is no longer capital does not make it socially neutral, right? Like there are plenty of things within a socialist society that would need to be like phased out for human welfare, right? For instance, like certain forms of labor, also like ecologically destructive forms of labor, even if they're taken out of like the web of capitalist social synthesis, they would still have socially destructive consequences. And that's speaking of like material machinery, right? And material things. The notion that social form, this is kind of like saying that there's no kind of like inherent social content to specific forms of social machinery. So anyway, these control levers, these legal institutions permit the influencing of the market and the directing of economic activity, and they must be judged as Marx judged the machinery of iron and steel. We must draw a clear distinction between these control levers as such and their use in the hands of a dictatorial oligarchy. We welcome the arrival and the development of these control levers, and we are prepared to admit frankly that their consolidation is as acceptable as a fact as the development of machinery in Marx's day. But like Marx, we denounce their utilization in the hands of an oligarchy of plutocrats and technocrats, which prevents the community having access to them. Unless they want to lapse into the primitive ideology of the machine breakers, democratic socialists must not aim at destroying what good has been created by the totalitarian dictatorships in this field. Just as Marx gave the workers the task of removing the machines from the absolute power of capital, we today must put forward as our task the removal of the control levers from the pitiless hands of a plutocracy, a bureaucracy, and a technocracy, in order that the community as a whole may become master of them. Let us therefore objectively examine the economic structure of the totalitarian states. In order to simplify matters, we propose to use the term quote fascist here for both Germany and Italy. The difference between the two economic systems is in fact one of degree and not of kind. Under organized capitalism, the growing influence of private monopolies and state institutions permits economic agents provided with a certain power to use the laws of the market instead of submitting to the laws of the market. The automatic distribution of commodities changes into a controlled distribution, and the automatic distribution of revenues changes into a dictatorially allotted distribution. The freedom of the immense majority of the economic agents to dispose of their property just as they like is limited no longer by the market alone, as formerly, but by the will of other agents more powerful than themselves. However, in spite of that, some freedom still prevails. The market is still the dominant factor. First of all, capital has still a certain margin of freedom to invest itself as it wishes. And secondly, the wage workers have still the freedom to choose what employment suits them. Under fascist economy, on the other hand, these two essential characteristics of capitalism disappear. The wage working class is enslaved, its organizations destroyed, and its conditions of work and life greatly deteriorated, but the employing class itself is also no longer free. The fascist dictatorship is in fact not the dictatorship of capitalism. In origin is the dictatorship of a very restricted fraction of the capitalist class, the monopolist and finance plutocracy over all other classes, but even this restricted fraction of the capitalist class does not enjoy absolute power. As a side note to this, I believe in the Nazi, Constitution, or the Nazi, party program. That's the word I'm looking for, party program. They call for the abolition of interest. Not to say that the Nazi party didn't, have use finance or anything like that. But there was definitely it is definitely some degree to which the totally top-down nature of fascism should have some caution about it. The notion, the general Marxist notion that it's like the fascists are like the vanguard of finance capital seems questionable to me. I'm not too much of an expert on Nazi Germany, but we should know that Nazi Germany, large parts of fascist ideology and a lot of anti-Semitic ideology is centered on this critique of finance as like this kind of like false economy, this unreal economy, and then like industrial capital, which is like real and earthy and connected to labor and like a people. Anyway, the fascist dictatorship, in origin, it is the dictatorship of a very restricted fraction of the capitalist class, the monopolist and finance plutocracy. I think also the Nazis also is what they generally use the term plutocracy to characterize the United States. Overall classes, but even this restricted fraction of the capitalist class does not enjoy absolute power. It is compelled to share economic power to an increasing extent with the state apparatus, with the fascist bureaucracy. In view of the innumerable economic functions exercised by the state in our day, that bureaucracy is not to be confused with the bureaucracy which existed under liberal capitalism. Being an economic factor of first-rate importance, the state today becomes the forcing house of a new class of exploiters. There are two disputes in competition between the plutocracy and the machinery of state, but we can also observe a progressive fusion between the two. Footnote. The Palace Revolution, which took place in February 1938 in Germany, was only a phase in this process. The same process is taking place in Italy, but more smoothly because there heavy industry is weak and plutocratic oligarchy less vigorous. End footnote. The state, in the hands of the plutocracy and the bureaucracy, enemies but allies, disposes of the means of production, controls the investment of capital, and reduces the wage workers to the level of slaves. Under fascist dictatorship, organization dominates the market, whereas under organized capitalism, the market still dominates organization. We can say, of course, that the elements of the fascist social structure already exist under organized capitalism. What is called the, quote, fascist revolution has certainly not created any new social structure. It has merely torn away the veil which, under organized capitalism, still covers already clearly developed relations. It releases something already existing within the framework of the preceding order, in just the same way as the bourgeois revolution released liberal capitalism, which is already constituted within the framework of the old society. In as far as fascism adopts, quote, nationalization, fascism is aiming merely to tighten the control of the ruling clique and still further to dispossess the smaller capitalists. Fascism establishes an absolute economic dictatorship of that clique over all other social classes. In addition to introducing forced labor for the wage workers, it carries out the expropriation of the smaller capitalists, the final act of capitalist evolution predicted by Marx. And even where this expropriation is not carried out by the brutal methods of adolescent capitalism, it takes place by the reduction of the smaller capitalists to the level of paid superintendents. What nominally remains, quote, their capital still bears its fruit, but it falls into the hands of others, the dominant clique. The essential difference between the Soviet economic system and that of the fascist countries lies in the fact that the new ruling class in Russia was not born of a fusion with the old oligarchy, because large-scale monopolist and finance capital in Russia was represented principally in the foreign capitalist element. That's interesting because some people, I'm not sure, was it Bordigo? I don't know. Maybe it was someone else. Maybe it's the Council Communists, or maybe Betalive. I'm not sure. Kind of characterized in a certain strange way, even though obviously the Russia was an empire. There's a certain degree of like the Bolshevik Revolution being like a nationalist revolution, insofar as like very much of the property of that was expropriated was not the property of Russians, but of foreign capital. I don't know if that's actually empirically true. if there's actually evidence of that, but it is like a kind of like argument that I've heard, just as a side note. That's way more apparent, I suppose, in cases where it was overthrown, where there was a more extreme decolonial element. Footnote: for want of a better term, we shall continue to use this one, although the Soviets have been officially suppressed in Russia. End footnote. In Germany and in Italy, the ruling class is Pluto-technocratic, whereas in Russia it is bureau-technocratic. In Germany and Italy, the ruling class is Pluto-technocratic, whereas in Russia, the ruling class is bureau-technocratic. With regard to property relations, we can observe a difference of degree but not of kind. The ruling clique in Russia does not possess the means of production which it dictatorially controls any more than the ruling clique in the fascist countries does. In Russia, these means of production are the property of the state, and in Germany and Italy they are property of the capitalist shareholders, but whilst the Pluto-technocracy in Germany and Italy does own quite an important part of the means of production, the Russian bureau-technocracy owns no part whatever. In both cases, however, the control of the whole economic apparatus is not bound up with property rights. Under different forms and by different methods, both Pluto-technocracy and bureau-technocracy have sounded the knell of the capitalist class. In the fascist countries, we can still observe the existence of capitalist characteristics, whereas in Russia these characteristics have been radically destroyed as a result of the absolute seizure of the state of all the means of production and distribution. Although the Russian economic system has often been called, quote, state capitalism, although the term, quote, state slavery employed by Karl Kautsky seems to us a more appropriate designation, in our opinion, the Russian regime is not slavery or serfdom or capitalism, but something of all three. It is related to slavery and serfdom by the absolute and total suppression of all freedom for the workers, who are tied by domestic passports to their places of residence, and often to their places of employment, like the feudal serf to the glebe. It is related to capitalism by the preservation of a great number of economic categories and legal forms. However, it is fundamentally different from any of these systems. With more reason, and of course with all those reservations proper to such historical comparisons, we may rather compare the present Russian regime with the social and economic regime of the Incas, who dictatorially governed Peru before the discovery of America, an authoritatively controlled economic system strongly marked by numerous communist traits, but with a division of society into classes. No one can say how and towards what this curious social system might have developed had not a brutal and rapacious conqueror brought it to a sudden and permanent end. It is quite certain, however, that on an infinitely larger scale, with an incomparably higher mass culture, and provided with all the achievements of 20th century science, our modern Incaism over what is called, quote, 1/6 of the globe, end quote, reproduces from the social and political point of view the most characteristic traits of Peruvian Incaism of 400 years ago. Just as the Russian state disposes absolutely over the material elements of the economic process, so it disposes dictatorially over the human element too. The workers are no longer free to sell their labor power where they like and how they please. They no longer enjoy freedom of movement on the territory of the USSR. Domestic passports. The right to strike has been suppressed, and if the workers expressed even the slightest desire to oppose the methods of Stakhanovism, it would expose them to the severest punishment. The Russian unions, strictly under the orders of the governing party, are merely organs charged with the execution in their own province of the political instructions of the government. The instruments destined to defend the working class against the directive organism of the economic system have become instruments in the service of these organisms. Footnote. In order to grasp this evolution, let us compare two texts. Lenin, in a speech against Trotsky before the communist delegates to the 7th Soviet Congress on the 30th of December 1920, quote, "When people ask us, why and against whom do you defend the working class, seeing that there is no longer a bourgeoisie and that the state is a working class state, they are committing an obvious error. The state is not quite a working class state, and that is everything. We have a working class state subject to democratic deformation," end quote. Lenin. Weinberg, one of the secretaries of the Russian Federation of Labor Unions, in a speech delivered in June 1933 and published in Trude on the 8th of July 1933, quote, "Some comrades in the factories still think that the unions should intervene in the fixing of wages on an equal footing with the administration. This is absolutely wrong. We must say that this is a left-wing opportunist deviation, a blow against the principle of undivided power. This sort of thing must be put an end to," end quote. Weinberg. And footnote. The working class thus finds itself subjected to the discretionary power of a bureau technocracy identical with the state apparatus. A discretionary power of a bureau technocracy identical with the state apparatus. Let us now try to form the standpoint. Let us now try from the standpoint of the qualitative distribution of income to compare the fascist and Soviet intermediary systems with liberal capitalism. Okay, so it says liberal capitalism. V equal to labor, P including wages of industrial profit and wages of superintendents, active capital, I functionless capital, R landed proprietors. Fascist economy, supreme form and negation of organized capitalism. V labor, VS directive superintendence of the bureau technocracy and of active capital. P plutocracy of the administrators without function and the peaks of the state apparatus. I investors. R landed proprietors. And then in the Soviet economy, V labor, VS including P directive superintendents of the bureau technocracy state apparatus. I insurance funds. R state apparatus. With regard to the remuneration of executive labor, we have preserved the designation V, though it must not be forgotten that in the fascist and Soviet system, wages no longer obey the automatism of the laws ruling capitalist economy. The most important and striking difference lies in the changing position of the, quote, functionless category. Under liberal capitalism, interest is the revenue par excellence of the functionless capitalists. Small investment not yet having spread amongst any important masses of the people. The small investors received only a very small fraction of the total interest, whilst the lion's share went into the hands of the lone capitalists. Under organized capitalism, of which fascist economy represents at one and the same time the highest expression and the negation, seeing that the essential characteristics disappear, interest becomes the revenue par excellence of the investor, whilst the functionless capitalist seizes the lion's share of surplus value, that is to say, profit. Footnote: the dividends of the small shareholders must be regarded as interest. End footnote. In Russia, the category I, which means what? Insurance funds, represents essentially an insurance fund, leaving aside, of course, those credit operations conducted as between one enterprise and another. Okay, that's interesting. Because what later state capitalists are going to argue, not the ones that are within the Trotskyist tradition, but ones that are later, are going to make a big deal about this kind of what they might call, I think, like Bettelheim calls, like the dual separation of capitalism, right? The separation of workers from the means of production, but also the separation between different and economic units. So that's interesting that he talks about enterprises. Anyway, in Russia, the category insurance funds represents essentially an insurance fund. So what I'm doing right there is I'm saying what the I that's on the actual page stands for. Leaving aside, of course, those credit operations conducted as between one enterprise and another. Interest here no longer remunerates the functionless capitalist, an evolution already foreshadowed in organized capitalism and in fascist economy. Where interest properly so called, dividends also tend more and more to be reduced to the category of interest, pure and simple, becomes the specific form of investment revenue. With regard to the category VS, which stands for what? Directive superintendence of the bureaucratocracy state apparatus. We observe that in the capitalist economy, VS means what? In the fascist economy, VS means directive superintendence of the bureaucratocracy and of active capital. And in the Soviet economy, VS is the directive superintendence of the bureaucratocracy state apparatus. Anyway, with regard to the category VS, we observe that in capitalism, it is joined with P, that in fascist economy and evolution already foreshadowed in organizing capitalism, it is separated, the wages of superintendents and industrial profit. And that in the Soviet economy, wages of superintendents and profit, or surplus, join up again. However, whilst wages of superintendents is an integral part of industrial profit in a capitalist economy, industrial profit is an integral part of the wages of superintendents in the Soviet economy. So I guess that means that, there's no distinction. Wages of that since ownership and control by the state are integrated, wages of superintendents and wages of superintendents and surplus are the same thing in the Soviet economy. Anyway, trying to make sense of these letters. I'm using letters. I kind of hate that. I wish they would just spell it out. It makes it so much easier. In the former case, the reward for directive labor appears as a part of profit, the revenue of exploitation, whilst in the latter case, profit or labor appropriated without return appears on the contrary as a part of the return for directive labor. In the fascist economy, industrial profit is appropriated by the plutocracy of administrators and by the peaks of the state apparatus. In the USSR, the plutocracy has been suppressed, and the plutocracy's revenues are appropriated by the state apparatus. The characteristics of the Soviet economic system are certainly more collectivist than those of other economic systems we have examined, all revenue appears as a return for labor, even the revenue of the bureaucratical oligarchy, the insurance funds being considered as remunerating labor past or future, is the first step towards the reunion of property and labor, but by no means of labor as a whole, but of directive labor only. It is the first step towards the reunion of property and labor, but by no means of labor as a whole, but of directive labor only. The revenue of the capitalist class arises out of its ownership of the means of production. The revenue of the monopolist and finance plutocracy arises out of its domination over the property of others. The revenue of the bureaucratic oligarchy in the USSR arises out of its administration as a usufructuary of what, on paper, is already the collective property of the community. In the Soviet economic system, there is no social class which is independent of the economic process. Footnote: journalists, writers, artists who are rewarded for singing the praises of the dictatorship in terms both dithyrambic and servile do not represent a social class. End footnote. Insofar as we can speak of parasitism in the Soviet economic system, it is a question of excessive number of bureaucrats and not of a special category of parasites. Each individual bureaucrat is, if you like, parasitic to the extent of 25% or even 50%, but the bureaucratic oligarchy as a whole fulfills a useful social function, although of course its remuneration is excessive. In the fascist economic system, we find parasitism raised to the highest power, embodied by industrial profit, which has here become the symbol of the revenue of the, quote, functionless. So I'm trying to follow this. In the fascist economy, we find parasitism raised to the highest power, embodied by P, which has here become the symbol of the revenue of the, quote, functionless. P, the most important part of wages of superintendents, falls into the pockets of a social class which is completely independent of the economic process. However, during the course of recent years, we have seen in this respect, as in many others, that the fascist economy is developing farther and farther away from the traditional capitalist structure and approximating steadily to the Soviet economic structure. In the expression, quote, plutotechnocratic, the accent is gradually shifting from the first term to the second. For the rest, we can predict an identical development in Russia. Parenthesis, it is foreshadowed here as there, in parenthesis, to the extent which the cadre is necessary for a rational administration of the enormous economic apparatus developed, the purely bureaucratic element will give way to the more technocratic element. This technocratic element is gradually acquiring a special technique, such as is also developing, but much more slowly in those countries which have as yet no experience of controlled economy, and in which liberal economic principles still prevail over directional principles. This technocratic element acquires in practice the technique of directing the economic system as a whole, whilst the experience of the economic technicians of Great Britain, France, and Belgium confines itself to a fragmentary and partial control. The economic technicians of the United States may be considered as being midway between the two. The technocratic element enjoys an advantage which can hardly be overestimated, but it is one which has proved expensive. Those who one day calculate the enormous wealth which this hurried apprenticeship served under the terribly unfavorable conditions of totalitarianism has spoiled, wasted, and destroyed will experience a shock sufficient to make their hair stand on end. The 5-year plans in the USSR, the ersatz regime in Germany, the active war economy in Italy, the economic nationalism of all these countries represents a crushing price to be paid for a measure of economic progress, which is being brought about once again on a basis of contradictions according to the well-known law of Marxist dialectics. If they did not intensify the danger of war, the detached observer of these upheavals would have no cause to deplore them, because it has rarely been the lot of the sociologists to be able to study so many simultaneous experiments. As it is, we cannot but feel sympathy for the poor guinea pigs who are being compelled to submit to this economic and social process of vivisection. The economic laws of liberal capitalism have already changed under organized capitalism, and they are functioning less and less under the fascist economic system, and not at all under the Soviet economic system. Footnote. In our book, L'Économie soviétique, written in 1930, I've been wanting to get my hands on this book. There's no English translation, nor any kind of digitized version of it where I could just throw on the Google Translate. So it's difficult. In our book, L'Économie soviétique, we sought to formulate a law of accumulation for the Soviet economic system. We followed the methods of Marx, who based his essential deductions upon the law of capitalist accumulation. Today we are compelled to recognize that in controlled economic systems of this kind, there is no law of accumulation in the automatic sense, such as characterizes capitalism. Economic life is no longer governed by the action of what liberal economists called, quote, natural economic laws, end quote. And the only economic law which prevails is that of rentability. For the rest, we maintain absolutely what we then wrote. Unfortunately, our most pessimistic predictions have already been largely surpassed by reality. And footnote. These economic systems are controlled according to plan. The Soviet economic system no longer experiences capitalist crises. The fascist economic system has been able to protect itself against the effect of such crises more easily than organized capitalist systems still having liberal capitalist characteristics. Footnote. Here, of course, we are dealing strictly with the economic position. With regard to the social side of the question, the whole world knows today that the absence of cyclical crises can nevertheless be synonymous with misery and famine. In footnote. This is explained by the fact that all the surplus product, or if you like, all the surplus value, is concentrated in the hands of a pseudo-technocratic or bureau-technocratic oligarchy. Again, this is something, wait, hold on. Wait, he's talking, what was he? I guess he's talking about surplus value, I guess, in the fascist case. Sorry, I was trying to see if he is talking about surplus value in the Soviet Union. This is explained by the fact that all the surplus product, or if you like, all the surplus value is concentrated in the hands of a pseudo-technocratic or bureau-technocratic oligarchy. This bureaucracy disposes absolutely of this surplus product and also absolutely controls its division into funds of consumption and funds of accumulation. Footnote. This, quote, consumption imposed by the dictators unfortunately refers more to guns and to other instruments of destruction than to butter, and to what are generally regarded as consumption goods in democratic countries. End footnote. This bureaucracy disposes of this surplus product and also absolutely controls its division into funds of consumption and funds of accumulation. It is it sees to it that a balance is maintained between the two. There can, of course, be no overproduction there. Crises can arise only as the result of accidents, due to insufficient forethought or to defective execution of plans, and not to any automatism similar to that prevailing in the capitalist economic system. These economic systems no longer obey spontaneous laws. Okay, so I think that when he was talking about surplus value, I think before he was referring to fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and the USSR. That's what I'm feeling right now. Maybe when I listen to this again later, I won't feel that way. These economic systems no longer obey spontaneous laws. They are not subject to the laws which govern the capitalist system. They are subject to one law only, a law which in any case governs all economic formations, no matter what they may be, the law of rentability. If this law is broken, then the economic system will suffer grave disturbances. The tragedy of the 5-year plan in the USSR and the economic convulsions in Germany and Italy are the best illustrations of this. I don't know what this law of rentability he just mentioned means. From a purely economic angle, these must be regarded as transitional systems closely related to each other, as also in a structural sense, they are closely related to the organized capitalism of the American, British, and French democracies. Footnote. The lucid observer, M. Pierre Dominique, pointed out these resemblances in a number of articles which appeared in 1937 in La République. In the same paper, he writes as follows. On the 14th of February 1938, quote, "On many occasions already I have stressed the great resemblance between the Bonapartism of Stalin and that of Hitler and Mussolini. For a certain time, the system of war communism established by Lenin hid the truth from us, but now we know that in both Germany and Italy, capitalism and trade unionism are being incorporated into and placed in the service of the state. In short, employers and workers' organizations have become a part of the state machinery. On the other hand, the Stalinist system creates a new elite corresponding to capitalism and to the middle classes of the Western countries and places it in the service of the state. This new elite, which enjoys special privileges, has quickly adopted all the old bourgeois prejudices and constitutes the backbone of the state." I actually think that's actually well, he's talking about the elite here, but like the notion of like the middle classes forming like the backbone of the state. I think that was a lot of where like Stalinism gained its popular support, is that like a lot of people were able. There's been this this term, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but there's a term that you use, the affirmative action state, where a lot of people have formerly poor backgrounds, such as like some peasants and workers, achieved a certain degree of prestige and affluence within the hierarchy of the Stalinist system, and that was like where a lot of the popular support came from, which is not just like the elite crust, right? Even though they would occupy like probably a more comfortable, in a lot of cases, occupy a more comfortable position than what they might otherwise if they were members of the working class. Anyway, and of course, as time goes on, the two systems develop. They resemble each other more and more. End quote. M. Pierre Dominique. M. Dominique also points out that, quote, "The democratic states tend to resemble more and more the totalitarian states, but always keeping that golden mean which their counterparts have proved unable to keep," end quote. Apart from the terminology, this is also our opinion. The terms Bonapartism can be applied only to a political regime and not to an economic structure, and the terms capitalism and trade unionism have just as much lost their meaning in Germany and Italy as in Russia. However, our disagreement refers solely to words and not to things. End footnote. These economic systems, American, British, and French democracies, display much clearer socialist characteristics. I gotta repeat the last sentence. Maybe I'm saying it wrong. From a purely economic angle, these must be regarded as transitional systems closely related to each other, as also in a structural sense they are closely related to the organized capitalism of the American, British, and French democracies. These economic systems display much clearer socialist characteristics than those in which the liberal element has not been completely overcome. It would, however, be a very grave error either to take the totalitarian state for a realization of the socialist ideal, an error into which many socialists have fallen with regard to Russia, or to believe that the decadence and transformation of capitalist economy must necessarily give rise to political forms similar to those prevailing in the three totalitarian states. As we shall see later, everything depends on the capacity for action and the intellectual maturity of the working class. A fruitful study of these, quote, intermediary economic forms, end quote, can be undertaken only with the assistance of the dialectical method of Marx. The bourgeois revolution sealed the triumph of an economic system which represented an immense step forward in comparison with previous modes of production. Marx stressed its progressive character on more than one occasion, but, armed with the dialectical method, he saw the class representing future progress at the base of the capitalist pyramid, which embodied present progress. As a declared enemy of all fatalism, Marx by no means counseled the proletariat to leave the field to its new masters and resign itself passively to the famous, quote, automatism of history, end quote, so dear to the mechanical Marxist, and so sacrifice future to present progress. Whilst recognizing the progressive character of capitalism, Marx regards the working class struggle against capital, and that at the beginning, and not at some hypothetical point of time when capitalism should perhaps have already become reactionary, as the surest instrument of historical progress and the best possible stimulant for all the progressive qualities of capital. We must take up exactly the same attitude towards the fascist and Soviet regimes. Whilst recognizing their progressive elements from the technical and economic angle, we should betray the ideas and methods of Marx if we relied on Pluto-technocrats and bureau-technocrats for the establishment of socialism. That is to say, if we regard them as the representatives of future progress. To each his part. The oligarchies are preparing the way for socialism in their fashion, just as capitalism is preparing it by accumulation, by centralization, by the development of the technical and administrative conditions for controlled economy, a matter of supreme importance, and by the intensification of its internal contradictions. To each his part. The workers have also theirs to play, but it is not the one assigned to them by their oppressors, and above all is the workers who represent the future. In other forms than those of capitalism, and on a higher scale, these intermediary systems are continuing the mission of capitalism. They are paving the way for the advent of socialist society. The centralization of the means of production, planned economy, the development of control levers, the increase of directive machinery, and the introduction of a more and more developed system of social bookkeeping are also indispensable conditions for a socialist society. From the standpoint of economic organization and control, these systems certainly represent a more advanced stage of the transitional period than the organized capitalist system of all other countries. Driven as they are by capitalism, however, they fulfill this mission on a basis of contradictions. To the extent to which their technical and administrative structure is gradually being, quote, socialized, social antagonisms are accentuated, thus preparing the way for a new upheaval which will place the working class in power and in possession of the economic control levers. The great thing is to know whether this new upheaval will take place under illegal forms. In those countries where the masses of the people are deprived of all democratic rights, we can see how they can reconquer them within the framework of existing dictatorial legality and by a peaceful transformation of that legality. Up to now, we have discussed these intermediate forms We have discussed these intermediary systems only from a purely economic angle. Must the new economic system, which we can see arising everywhere out of the chaos of decadent capitalism, necessarily result in the establishment of a totalitarian political structure? Those who reply to this question in the affirmative belong mainly to the camp of those mechanical Marxists who think they can find an exactly corresponding economic cause for each political happening. If we are to be faithful to the method of Marx, we must distinguish carefully between essential and accessory factors, and never forget that the process of evolution in which we are involved is brought about by the clash of antagonistic forces. The development of our contemporary economic system towards a technocratic structure is a fact difficult to deny, but the productive population as a whole, and not merely the wage-working class, whilst being involved in that evolution, is not called upon to submit to it passively. It also has a word to say, and its own aspirations to express. However, before going on to deal with this, we must first clear up a particularly salient point in present-day economic development. Okay, so I've decided that I'm going to split this chapter in half. I didn't think the sections would be as long as they have been. I might actually split it up into fourths, but the next section is titled The Technocratic Menace and Democracy.